Now, according to ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula, the party is engaged with Zanu-PF in Zimbabwe on issues of renewal and strengthening bilateral relations. The ANC has expressed its support for President Emmerson Mnangagwa following his election victory. President Cyril Ramaphosa was part of the 3 SADC heads of state that attended Mnangagwa's inauguration on Monday. For more on this, we are now joined by political analyst Professor Ntsikelelo. Breakfast. A very good morning to you, Professor. Thank you so much for your time. How should we begin to interpret these bilateral talks, which have been described as delicate between the ANC and Zanu-PF?
In 2007, when former President Zuma was elected in Polokwane, one of the resolutions of the ANC was to strengthen its relations with other liberation movements on the African continent. So I think the bilateral meeting between the two is a continuation of that. But my concern is the fact that the ANC is turning a blind eye to the human rights abuses in Zimbabwe. I'm not convinced that, the outcomes of the elections are free and fair, and that the electorate were not, threatened by the state. I think those elections are questionable. So I think liberation movements have a history of covering each other's backs, and we see that in what has happened in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, because matters like the Zimbabwean diaspora in South Africa or the ongoing challenges in Zimbabwe, those could also be issues that need to be coming to the forefront, especially when we try and assess how these discussions could impact the stakeholders.
No, for sure. But also South Africa, I'm talking about government now, has a history of having a softy approach towards Zimbabwe. During the time of former President Mbeki, we had a policy called quiet diplomacy, where former President Mbeki described the Zimbabwe crisis as a political and economic disaster, not acknowledging that it was a crisis because of these relations between the two organizations. But the other issue is that there is a common denominator between the ANC and Zanu-PF, which is the fact that if you look at where they solicit votes, the majority of the votes of the ANC and the Zanu-PF, they come from the rural section of the population as opposed to urban centers. So Zanu-PF, its support in urban centers has shrunk. In the same way, the support of the ANC in urban centers has also shrunk. So they've got a lot to share and to talk about. No wonder I think that they've met to maybe they will have a political exchange, especially the ANC, on how also to perform well in the upcoming general elections. Yeah.
So would you say the ANC appears to be employing a strategy to soften Zanu-PF and perhaps buy leverage in these closed-door discussions, and also perhaps considering what the political implications may be, especially exploring how the discussions could influence the political dynamics within South Africa and Zimbabwe?
One of the things that we have seen in post-colonial states has been the application of nativism, which is basically a way of exploiting historical factors by refusing to take some kind of a responsibility. So liberation movements have a tendency to divert the attention of the people to the West instead of acknowledging that it falls short sometimes of promoting a development to the majority. So Zanu-PF has been doing that in terms of the issue of the land question. In the same way, the ANC also has been doing that. So there are things which are common between these two political parties. That's why government has been refusing to denounce the human rights abuses in Zimbabwe.
Then what about the broader regional implications of these talks? Could we then see, come to a point where we see that there could be potential shifts in policies, perhaps strategies, or cooperation in the Southern African region?
There are strong relations amongst these liberation movements. For instance, if you look at the liberation movements which are still in power, I think it's Frelimo in Mozambique, in Namibia, I think it's SWAPO, in Zimbabwe, it's ZANU, and even in our own backyard, it's the ANC. So they have things which are common, and how they have held on to power has been, this narrative that they are the only vehicle towards a development, and that the people have not been fully participating in the economy. So there are things that they can share in terms of how to improve each other's electoral performance.
Immigration is now a major election issue ahead of the general elections next year. How do you imagine that in the delicacy of these discussions that we're hearing about, that the issue of illegal immigrants could now factor the ZEP matter as well? How do you think that approach would need to be in order, as these talks continue?
Yeah, that is one of the security threats which is posing danger to our country. But at the same time, it's a sensitive issue. Remember, I can't remember when it was, but President Ramaphosa was booed in Zimbabwe because there was a feeling that Zimbabweans are not treated well in our country. So government has been very circumspect in terms of addressing that issue. But also, I think Zimbabweans, they won a case of late in terms of their extension,
yes.
In the country. So that is not something that government wants to be forthright and outright about. It's one of those things that are discussed fully behind closed doors, as opposed to be vocal in public, because it can be interpreted in a negative way if government comes across to be very much abrasive.
And how do you imagine that will now factor into elections next year and the electioneering as it happens on the ground with the, what's at stake, especially looking at the economic implications of the country and what people are saying on the ground?
Paul, my view is that many social conflicts are caused by the failure of addressing human needs. Human beings have needs. When their needs are not met, that creates a scope for conflict to rise to a prominence. So the challenge that we have is that we have limited resources in the country. I'm sure you must have heard in one of the weekly newspapers that government is running out of funds. So the challenge is that people are competing over scarce resources. And there have been, I think, people who are discontent on the ground. We've seen trucks being set on fire on a large scale. So this is a very sensitive issue. And some people think that the reason why on the economic front, they are bearing the brunt in terms of unemployment, inequality, poverty, it's due to foreign nationals. Of course, that argument is flawed, because even if you can drive away all the people who are here illegally, I can bet my bottom dollar, you will still have these economic challenges.
Yeah, very well. Thank you so much, Professor Ntsikelelo Breakfast, giving us a sense of what may the relations between Zanu-PF and ANC look like as those discussions, bilateral talks, continue throughout the next few days.